Alright, and now that I'm in your mainframe, let's get started with the actual video. Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and this is the series in which I go over additions to my custom C++ engine game, which features its own level editor as well as different abilities to play the levels, which are all on your screen now. This is devlog number 2, and before we get started, I just wanted to give a massive thank you to anyone that watched my last video. It got way more views than I was expecting, and I just wanted to say that I'm really, really grateful to everyone who tuned in. If you're new here, and if you'd like, please leave a like below and subscribe. Anything helps out so much. And once again, just thank you everybody for being so supportive. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into what I want to add to the game in today's devlog. Alright, hello everybody. So for today, I want to try and expand on the topic that I covered in my last devlog with these pushable sort of boxes. Now, instead of just being able to push them, I also want to add the ability for Squidimus to be able to pick them up and sort of carry them over his head. He has to be able to move with these boxes, obviously, and it has to just sort of stay connected and just look pretty good overall. Now, number two, I want him to not just be able to carry them for no reason, but I also want to give him the ability to actually put them down. So this is going to let him carry these boxes as well as place them in other spots now instead of just being able to push them. And this is going to be done by right-clicking on the screen. Now, three, obviously I want him to actually have movement with all of these boxes. This is going to be a little bit different than pushing them because he's going to have to be able to jump with these boxes to both stack them up as well as actually get over obstacles. And obviously he's going to be moving in his arc kind of motion just like that, and that's all going to require custom sprites. A very important thing though, I want these boxes to actually interact with the things around them. So whenever, as you just saw there, the box being hit collides out with something else and it's no longer being carried. Lastly, the main feature of these blocks is I want Squinimus to be able to throw them. I want, with the press of a left click button, I want them to be able to throw at things and interact with the walls and just have gravity, and I want him to be able to throw them sort of like Donkey Kong style, I guess. And that's essentially just the main portion of everything that I want to do today. Hopefully, it's not going to be too difficult, but we'll definitely have to see and get into it. Don't mind the like and subscribe, right? But let's go ahead and get into the actual coding portion of everything. Now, just like any other implementation to a project such as this, I had to first begin with drawing my own assets. This is where I use Sprite, and as I have stated before, Sprite is a software which is designed specifically for drawing in pixel art, and it's what I use for all of my customly drawn assets in my game. But essentially for this, I knew that I had to draw a few different assets. Now, there would be no new assets for the actual movables, but Squiddimus was going to gain a lot more abilities, meaning that I would have to draw him in different states. This includes both the actual hold animation as well as the movement for this holding, such as the ability to jump while holding a block, as well as the ability to walk while holding a block. All of these themselves would have to be different animations that I would also then have to implement in my as animation class, which would basically change each one of these animations depending on certain conditions that are met, which I just use if statements for and as are all on your screen as of current. Now, they say that you should make your game work before you make it actually look pretty, but I always tend to do the opposite. So it's time to actually implement this feature. And the very first thing that I did was I set a listener within of my S2 action class to look out for left action clicks, as well as the other condition of if the current player was actually pushing a block. And if this condition was actually resolved, what I would then proceed to do is update a new shared pointer within of my scene class to now hold the block that was being held. This allowed me to actually iterate over the block so that way I was able to continuously update its position to the players by being able to set its position, its X position, to the same position as the player, and its Y position to the same as the player, minus the actual player animation sprite. And this essentially worked because it gave me a box that followed my player no matter what happened. It also allowed me to have a stored pointer that I would be able to then loop over or just see if it was not null, and it allowed me to check collisions via axis aligned bounding boxes. This means that I was able to actually see whenever the currently held overhead box collided with another box, essentially allowing me to then empty out that pointer and allow for the box to go out of Squidamous' hands if it detected movement. So essentially, it solved both number one and number two of my previously established goals and set me off to a wonderful start. Up next was actually implementing the feature in which Squidamous would be able to put down a block. For this, I once again needed to pick up the paintbrush and create a new sprite for Squidamous to be able to actually place down his blocks. Now, the coding implementation here wasn't too difficult. I essentially just wrote a little function that allowed me to switch the position of Squidamous and the box, which essentially just did exactly what I needed it to do. It emptied out the pointer and swapped the positions correctly. However, I noticed that upon implementation, this looked a little bit too choppy, and so I also added in another helper function and drew even more assets that essentially spawned in dust clouds whenever Squidmus jumped or put down a block or the block just detected a collision with anything below it. And I think that this helped it look a lot more lively and just a lot smoother and more realistic overall. But after that, it was simply done, and I could move on to my last and definitely most daunting challenge. This was actually implementing the ability to throw these blocks with the press of the left click button. Now, this meant obviously looking out for another listener here in order to see if the left button was pressed while I was holding a block over my head. But this was not the difficult part. The difficult part was the gravity. Gravity itself in the game was very difficult because it's something that holds an acceleration and therefore needs to be constantly added to the velocity in order to make it look natural. Now, doing this was difficult because you had to turn off gravity for what is essentially the first portion of the uprising, while then putting it back on after having reached a certain threshold. Now, the game had already interpreted gravity using the player by implementing the jump mechanic earlier, and this is essentially what I piggybacked off of. Using my S movement function, I used a condition to see whether I should be applying upwards velocity or be applying downwards gravity. And this essentially ended up working. However, it did come with a few caveats that had to be fixed, wherein I had to detect the proper timing by which move the block back down. And what I ended up going with was just the same threshold that the player had had, and it essentially made it so that way the throwing animation as well as the player jump animation would look very similar, which ended up looking not too bad. This, however, did lead to excess problems within my collisions class because I now had to detect whether the block was rising or falling within of its collision function. Now, the collision function is the thing that also detects whether a block is grounded or not by having that shifted axis aligned bounding box. So essentially, I only had to check for collisions while the block was moving downward. However, if the block collided with another block while it was moving upward, it would simply travel through that block. And after an absolutely embarrassing amount of trial and error, I ended up settling on only checking the if statement that checks if the block is grounded while it is still moving downwards. This means, though, that I then had to also add an extra check during the collisions to set the blocks of both x and y velocities to 0, so that way it would proceed to fall down. And this eventually left me with a finished product that, after many, many hours of coding, ended up looking exactly like this.